The moment my mother stepped out of the car, I knew this was going to be harder than I thought. Her face was pale, her movements slow, and even as she tried to smile, I could see the strain behind it. Charlie Reynolds wasn't the kind of woman who liked needing help. She had spent 27 years as a cop, most of it as Boston's first female police chief. She was the strongest person I knew. But major back surgery doesn't care how tough you are. Her doctor said she'd need at least 2 months to recover, and there was no way I was letting her do it alone. "You sure this isn't too much trouble, sweetheart?" Mom asked as I helped her out of the car. She winced, gripping my arm for support. "Of course not," I said, forcing a smile as I grabbed her bags. "The guest room is all set up. You'll be comfortable in no time." I didn't mention how worried I was. How she looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way I had never seen before. Instead, I focused on getting her inside, carrying her medical equipment up the steps as quickly as possible. But as I reached the door, I felt eyes on us. Across the street, standing with arms crossed and a clipboard in hand, was Margot Lancaster. HOA president. Community tyrant. A woman who had spent the last 8 years making everyone's lives miserable. Her blonde bob was perfectly styled, her blouse crisp and pressed, and her smile so forced it made my skin crawl. She didn't wave. She didn't say hello. She just watched. "Who's that?" Mom whispered, following my gaze. "Margot Lancaster," I muttered. "HOA president. Self-appointed neighborhood sheriff." Mom didn't say anything, but when I opened the door, she took one last glance at Margot and sighed. I've dealt with her type before. I hoped she was right. But ignoring Margot wasn't an option. The next morning, before my mom was even awake, I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Violation, unauthorized resident change. Fine, $100 per day until resolved. I ripped it down before my mother could see. The last thing she needed was more stress. I just explained to the HOA that Mom was a temporary guest, not a new resident. Reasonable people would understand. But Margot wasn't reasonable. By that afternoon, my phone was already blowing up with messages from Jason J. Carter, my only ally on the HOA board. "Margot called an emergency meeting about your mom. She's saying her medical equipment is a neighborhood aesthetic issue. Watch your back." I peeked through the window. Margot was walking door to door, clipboard in hand, pointing at my house. My blood boiled. But I stayed calm. Mom needed peace, not war. At least, that's what I told myself. I didn't know yet that peace was never an option. The second violation notice came 2 days later, and this time, it wasn't just a fine. It was a formal complaint from the HOA board. Eviction proceedings. I stared at the paper in my hands, my stomach twisting into knots. The notice claimed I was harboring an unauthorized long-term guest, in violation of community bylaws. I had 14 days to comply or vacate the property. A cold, sinking feeling settled in my chest. Margot wasn't just trying to harass me. She was trying to force me out of my own home. I stormed across the street, fists clenched, and knocked, hard, on Margot's door. It swung open almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for me. She smiled, her eyes flicking down at the paper in my hand. "Sarah," she said sweetly, leaning against the doorframe. "Is there a problem? You're trying to evict me? Are you serious?" My voice was shaking with barely contained rage. "My mother is recovering from surgery. She's not a tenant, she's my family." Margot sighed and shook her head as if I were a child who just didn't understand. "Rules are rules, dear. The HOA residency guidelines clearly state that anyone staying longer than 14 days requires board approval. And since you didn't submit the proper paperwork, she trailed off with a smug little shrug. I could barely breathe. You can't be serious. You don't get to tell me whether my mother can stay with me. Oh, but I do, she said lightly. That's how good neighborhoods stay good, by enforcing policies. Otherwise, people start taking advantage. Taking advantage? I repeated, my voice rising. She's in a wheelchair half the time. She can't even. Margot tilted her head like she found me amusing. If you're that upset, Sarah, you're welcome to appeal the board's decision at the next HOA meeting. I knew how those meetings worked. Rigged votes. Stacked decisions. Margot controlled the board. The outcome was already decided. I'm not going anywhere, I said through gritted teeth. Margot's smile widened. Then I guess we'll see what happens in 14 days. I turned on my heel and walked away before I did something I'd regret. My hands were shaking by the time I got back inside. I didn't tell Mom. She was already exhausted, already fighting just to move without pain. I couldn't put this stress on her. Instead, I called a lawyer, a friend from college who specialized in property law. She laughed when I explained what was happening. She's bluffing, my friend said. HOAs can fine you, sure, but they can't just kick you out of your home for letting a family member stay during medical recovery. That would violate state tenant protection laws. Relief flooded me. So I'm fine? Oh, you're fine, she said. But Margot won't stop here. She was right. Because the next day, animal control showed up at my door. A uniformed officer stood on my porch, looking uncomfortable as he scanned a clipboard. Ms. Reynolds? We received a report that there's an aggressive animal at this residence. We need to conduct an inspection. My jaw dropped. Aggressive animal? I didn't own a dog. Then it hit me. Margot. I kept my voice steady. There must be a mistake. I don't have a pet. The officer hesitated. The complaint mentioned a large, dangerous dog seen outside the property. It specifically noted concerns for community safety. I wanted to laugh. It was so absurd, so obviously fabricated, but then I noticed Margot standing across the street, watching. She smiled and waved. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding in fury. I don't have a dog, I repeated, forcing myself to stay calm. And I'd like to know exactly who filed this complaint. The officer hesitated. We can't disclose that information, ma'am. Of course. I took a deep breath. Well, since I don't have a pet, I assume this case is closed? He sighed. For now. He glanced past me, his eyes softening when he spotted the medical equipment in the hallway. Look, he said, lowering his voice. I don't know what's going on here, but this kind of complaint. It doesn't just happen. Someone's targeting you. I swallowed hard, nodding. I already knew who. As the officer left, Margot called out in a sickly sweet voice, "Everything okay, Sarah? No dangerous animals inside, I hope?" I ignored her and slammed the door. That night, as I sat on the couch beside Mom, helping her adjust her oxygen machine, I felt exhausted down to my bones. Margot wasn't just trying to find me. She was trying to make my life hell. And I had a sinking feeling she wasn't done yet. It happened at exactly 3:12 a.m. I woke up to a sound that sent my heart into overdrive, my mother gasping for air. I bolted upright, the room still dark except for the dim glow of her oxygen monitor. The numbers were dropping. Fast. Mom. I scrambled to her bedside, my hands shaking as I adjusted her pillows and reached for her hand. Her grip was weak, her chest rising in shallow, ragged breaths. I can't, she wheezed, her voice barely there. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling as I pressed it to my ear. My mother, she just had major back surgery, her oxygen levels are dropping fast. The dispatcher's voice was calm, controlled. An ambulance is on the way. Stay with her, keep her upright. Help is coming. I clutched my mom's hand as I whispered, just hold on, Mom. They're coming. Then I heard it. A car door slamming outside. At first, I thought it was the paramedics, but when I glanced out the window, my stomach turned to ice. Margot Lancaster's black Escalade was backing into my driveway. I could hardly process what I was seeing. Why? Why was she moving her car at this hour? And then it clicked. She was blocking the ambulance. On purpose. Panic turned to rage. I jumped up, sprinting to the door. The sirens were getting closer. They would be here in seconds, but there was no way they could reach us with Margot's SUV blocking the only direct path. I threw the door open and ran across the lawn, banging my fists against Margot's door like a madwoman. Margot! Move your car. Right now. A long pause. Then, slowly, she opened the door. She looked annoyed. Like I had just interrupted her beauty sleep. Sarah, she sighed. Do you have any idea what time it is? I was breathing too hard to scream. My heart pounded so hard in my chest it physically hurt. Move. You're... Sir, I snarled. My mother can't breathe. The ambulance is almost here. Margot raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. Then she glanced over my shoulder toward the flashing lights. And then, I saw it. The way her lips curled ever so slightly. She was enjoying this. Oh, Sarah, she tooted. You really should have requested prior approval for emergency vehicles. It's in the bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 8. I almost lost it right there. I took a step closer, my hands shaking with fury. Are you serious? This is my mother's life. Margot just smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. I felt something snap inside me. I turned and ran back toward the street, waving my arms frantically at the ambulance that had just pulled up, lights flashing, sirens wailing. The paramedics jumped out. What's the situation? I pointed furiously at the SUV. She blocked the driveway. You can't get through. One of the paramedics cursed under his breath. We'll have to go around. They grabbed the stretcher, moving as fast as they could through my neighbor's yard, their boots crunching against the frozen grass. Precious seconds were slipping away. And then, I saw Margot do something that made my blood run cold. She pulled out her phone and started recording. I was frozen in disbelief. She was filming the whole thing. The paramedics struggling to get the stretcher through the uneven yard. My mother fighting for air. Then she turned the camera on herself. As you can see, board members, she said, her voice syrupy sweet, this is exactly what happens when residents fail to follow proper procedure. Unauthorized guests. Unregistered medical equipment. And now, they want to blame the HOA for their lack of planning. I saw red. I lunged for her phone. Margot yanked it away, laughing. Laughing. You're insane, I whispered. Rules are rules, she shot back. Behind me, the paramedics had finally reached the porch. Mom's lips were turning blue. I ran to help them, shoving my rage down, focusing on my mother. One of the paramedics strapped an oxygen mask over her face, his voice tight. BP's dropping fast. We need to transport her now. Another paramedic, a tall guy named Mike, turned to me. Why is that woman still in the way? I took a shaky breath. She thinks she's above the law. Mike didn't hesitate. He pulled out his radio. Dispatch, be advised, possible obstruction of emergency services. We need police backup. That was the first time Margot's smile faltered. She took a step back. Oh, come on, now, that's a bit dramatic, isn't it? Then she did something I never saw coming. She reached into her robe pocket, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to Mike. A thick, stuffed envelope. Why don't we just call this a misunderstanding, she said smoothly. I'm sure we can work something out. Mike stared at it for a second. Then, without a word, he turned on his body camera. Margot froze. I'm gonna need you to repeat that, ma'am, Mike said, his voice dangerously calm. Because it sounded like you were trying to bribe a first responder. Margot's face turned dead white. She jerked her hand back, stuffing the envelope away. Don't be ridiculous, she stammered. I was just. The radio crackled. Copy that. Units en route. ETA 3 minutes. Margot whipped her head toward me, her eyes blazing. You don't know who you're messing with, she hissed. I stared her down. Neither do you. She didn't move. She just stood there, gripping her clipboard like a lifeline, her knuckles white. The sirens in the distance grew louder. Margot finally stepped back. And for the first time since I moved into this neighborhood, I saw something flicker across her face. Not arrogance. Not condescension. Fear. The moment the first police cruiser turned onto our street, Margot took a step back, her bravado flickering. She had spent years ruling this neighborhood with an iron fist, and now, for the first time, she had lost control. The flashing blue lights reflected off her oversized SUV as Officer Dan Harris stepped out of his squad car, his face grim. I had known Dan since I was a kid. He had been one of my mother's officers when she was still on the force. He took one look at the scene, the ambulance parked at an awkward angle, the paramedics rushing to get my mother inside, Margot still standing there clutching her clipboard like it could protect her, and his eyes darkened. Who called this in? His voice was sharp, cutting through the cold night air. One of the paramedics, Mike, turned, his body camera still rolling. We did. This woman, he pointed at Margot, intentionally blocked the driveway, delaying emergency medical transport. Then she attempted to offer me a bribe to keep quiet about it. Margot sputtered. That is a complete and utter mischaracterization. I was merely trying to save it, Dan snapped. Step away from the vehicle. Margot froze. For the first time since this nightmare started, she didn't have a response. She didn't have an answer, a rule, a policy to hide behind. My heart was still pounding as I climbed into the back of the ambulance beside my mother. Her breathing was stabilizing, the oxygen mask feeding much-needed air into her lungs, but her fingers were still cold in mine. As the doors shut, I caught one last glimpse of Margot. She was still standing there, paralyzed, as Dan reached for his radio. This is Officer Harris, requesting additional units at Pine Crest Estates. We have a suspect obstructing emergency services and engaging in attempted bribery of a first responder. Proceeding with detainment. Margot's eyes went wide. And then I saw it. The fear finally set in. The last thing I heard before the sirens drowned everything out was her husband, Rick, shouting from their front porch. Margot, what the hell did you do? By the time I reached the hospital, the news had already spread. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Texts from neighbors. Missed calls. A voicemail from Tom, who had seen everything go down and was practically vibrating with excitement. Sarah, you're not gonna believe this, someone got the whole thing on video. The bribe, the ambulance delay, everything. It's already online. I barely had time to process it before I was pulled into the chaos of the emergency room. Doctors. Nurses. Machines beeping. My mother's vitals stabilizing, but still dangerously weak. The hours blurred. I stayed by her side, gripping her hand, watching her breathe. It wasn't until 5 a.m. that a nurse finally nudged me awake. "She's asking for you," she said gently. I sat up so fast my neck cracked. Mom was propped up against the pillows, her face pale but her eyes sharper than they had been all night. And the first words out of her mouth: "Did they arrest her?" I blinked. "Mom, seriously?" Her lips curled weakly. "I need to know if justice was served." I exhaled a laugh, shaking my head. "They detained her. But I don't know what happens next." Mom's expression darkened. "Call Officer Harris." I should have known she wouldn't rest until she knew. I stepped out into the hallway, rubbing my eyes as I called Dan. He picked up on the second ring. "Sarah," he said, his voice sounding more awake than mine. "How's the chief?" "She's okay. Stable. Demanding answers." Dan let out a tired chuckle. "Yeah, that sounds about right." Then his voice sobered. "It's bad for Margot. Real bad. The department reviewed the footage. We've got clear obstruction of emergency services, attempted bribery, and witness intimidation." A chill ran down my spine. What happens now? There's enough for formal charges. If she's convicted, we're looking at 5 to 10 years. I sucked in a breath. That's a lot. She did this to herself, Dan said. And that's not even the worst of it. I frowned. What do you mean? Dan sighed. Margot's been on the HOA board for 8 years, right? Well, turns out, this isn't the first time she's pulled something shady. We've already had 3 different families come forward with complaints, harassment, targeted fines, threats of forced evictions. I gripped the phone tighter. You're telling me this is a pattern? A pattern that's about to bite her in the ass, Dan confirmed. And Sarah, she's pissed. You should have seen her at the station. Screaming about lawsuits. Blaming everyone but herself. Rick looked like he wanted to disappear. I pressed a hand to my forehead. Jesus. Dan's voice lowered. But listen, the DA wants to talk to you. They might need your testimony. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. I had spent weeks trying to avoid conflict with Margot. Trying to keep things from escalating. But this? This wasn't just about me anymore. She could have killed my mother. She had spent years terrorizing this community, hiding behind a fake smile and a clipboard, pretending she was just following the rules, while she destroyed people's lives. And now she was finally paying for it. I opened my eyes. I'll do it, I said. Tell them I'll testify. Dan's voice was firm. Good. It's time we take her down for good. I hung up and walked back into my mother's hospital room. She looked at me expectantly. Well? I sat down beside her, gripping her hand. She's done, Mom. The whole neighborhood's turning against her. She's finally losing. Mom exhaled slowly, closing her eyes. When she opened them again, there was something new in them. Not just exhaustion. Not just relief. Satisfaction. And as I sat there, watching her rest, I realized something. For the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't afraid anymore. 2 weeks later, I walked into the HOA emergency meeting with my mother by my side. She insisted on wearing her full police uniform, despite still recovering, and I knew exactly why. She wanted them to see her for who she really was, not just a woman who had been harassed, not just another resident bullied into silence, but a leader, a fighter, and someone who had spent decades upholding real laws, not the twisted HOA bylaws Margot had weaponized. The room was packed. Dozens of neighbors filled the seats, whispering amongst themselves. Some looked angry, others embarrassed, and a few still looked afraid of what would happen now that Margot wasn't in control anymore. At the front, the remaining HOA board members sat stiffly, none of them meeting my eyes. Greg Mitchell, the acting president, cleared his throat. "We're here tonight to address the recent events," he began awkwardly. He didn't get to finish. Tom stood up from the back, his voice loud and clear. "We don't need to address anything. We need to vote." He turned to the crowd. "Who here believes Margot Lancaster should be permanently removed from the HOA board?" Hands shot up everywhere. The vote was unanimous. Margot was officially stripped of all power. But it wasn't just about her anymore. Mom stood, her voice steady despite everything she had been through. "This isn't just about one person. This is about how we let things get this bad in the first place." She placed a folder on the table. "These are safety protocols used by HOAs across the country. They protect residents from harassment, ensure emergency vehicles have unrestricted access, and prevent abuse of power. If this board wants to earn back this community's trust, you'll implement them immediately." A murmur spread through the crowd. People nodded. Some even applauded. Greg exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I motion to implement the Reynolds Emergency Safety Initiative." Seconded. All in favor? Every single hand went up. That was it. That was the moment the power shifted. By the next morning, Margot and her husband put their house up for sale. The woman who had once ruled over this community like a queen had lost everything: her position, her influence, and, most importantly, her ability to control people through fear. The neighborhood changed after that. People started talking again. Helping each other. The same neighbors who had once stayed silent out of fear now stood together, refusing to let another Margot rise to power. 1 month later, I was elected to the new HOA board. Not because I wanted power, but because I wanted to make sure no one ever went through what my mother and I did. And sometimes, when I pass by Margot's old house, now owned by a kind family with 2 kids and a dog, I wonder if she ever truly understood where real power comes from. Not from rules and fines. Not from a clipboard or a title. But from a community that finally decided to stand together. So what about you? Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA, or a Karen, who thought they were above the law? Share your experience below, let's see who had it worse.